Hello, my name is Larry, also known as the Old Gazer, and this is the Old Gazer channel, which is intended to be a resource channel for beginning or inexperienced amateur astronomers. And the goal of the channel is simply to try to provide some practical information that might help you as a new or beginning amateur astronomer pursue this wonderful hobby. So that's what we're all about. I hope this will prove beneficial to you. And with that, let me just thank you for watching, and let's get started. First video I've done in a while. I've been a little bit under the weather. Everything is fine, back to normal and ready to go. And today I want to do something in which I'm going to use myself as a negative example. I'm going to share with you some things that I did that you should not do as an amateur astronomer, and certainly not as a beginning amateur astronomer. I'm calling this video How Not to Buy a Telescope. Now, many of you, probably most of you, already have a telescope. Some of you might not have one yet. Some of you might be looking to buy another telescope other than the one you already have. Some of you may be looking to move up to a little bit better telescope. Whatever the case might be, this video is not really so much about buying a telescope as it is to illustrate, the things that I've been preaching, I guess, over and over again in all of the videos I've done in this on this channel. And I've tried to make the point over and over again that amateur astronomers are people that have to exercise a lot of patience. Amateur astronomers have to be willing to take the time to do the right things the right way, and so forth. And this video is probably, or it's intended to be, an example of what happens when you don't do that. It's hopefully an illustration based on a failing of mine. You're gonna see some negative stuff at my expense here on this video, but this is supposed to be an indication of what happens when you fail to be patient and you fail to take the time to do the right things the right way. And the way I'm going to illustrate the ramifications of that is to talk about some bad decisions that I made in the purchase of a telescope. And hopefully you'll learn from what I did and not make the same mistakes I did and going forward. So buying a telescope, or buying telescope gear in general, astronomy gear, can, unless you're one of those people who, one of those few people for whom money is not an object, it can take you down a rabbit hole of great expense in a hurry. I mean, amateur astronomy can be a very expensive hobby. You can chase bigger and bigger telescopes with more and more aperture. You can chase electronic telescopes with computerized mounts. You can go after astro cameras with guide scopes and auto-guided capability and all of that. You can spend a very great deal of money very, very quickly if you've got the money to spend. Now, most of us don't have a lot of money lying around to spend on our hobby, and that means we have to use some discretion and some common sense when it comes to buying astronomy gear. And that's always been the case for me, and I presume that it's probably the case with many of you as well. You just don't have a lot of money to spend on the hobby, and so you have to be careful in how you go about buying telescopes and buying astronomy gear. I made some bad decisions not too long ago when I bought a telescope, and I wound up ill-spending some money that I probably could have spent much better had I made different decisions. Let me give you the background a little bit. Not so long ago, I was sort of away from the hobby. Now, if you remain with this hobby as long as I have, for many, many years, many decades actually, there will be times when you won't be able to participate in the hobby to the extent that you would like to do so. The pressures of life and other priorities and those kind of things are going to crowd in, and you're going to have to sort of move your obsession with your hobby back a notch or two so that you can deal with these other aspects of life. And I was at such a place not so long ago. I was not really deeply involved in the hobby. I had gotten rid of almost all of my telescopes, and I just had not been able to give much time to the hobby. And then things changed, and I saw that the opportunity was ahead of me to plunge into the hobby again and get back into it again and really pursue it and have fun with it. But I had a problem. I only had one telescope at that time, a very small 70 millimeter refracting telescope, and there were some mechanical issues with that telescope that made it very difficult to use. So I was at the point where if I wanted to get back into this hobby and plunge into it like I wanted to do, I was in need of a telescope. And so I set about the process of buying myself a telescope to get myself back going with the hobby again. Now, I decided that I wanted to get a reflecting telescope, and I didn't have a lot of money to spend, which I never do, which probably puts me in good company with many of you. And so I was looking for a modest reflecting telescope, just as a way to kind of gradually ease me back into the hobby again, and head me on the road to getting more deeply involved. So what did I do? Well, I was so eager to get a telescope and to get going again, and that I did something that I don't do very often. I made a rash, impulsive decision. I failed to do what I've indicated in past videos in this series that you have to do if you're going to be successful as an amateur astronomer. I failed to be patient, and I failed to take the time to do the right things the right way. I failed to do my due diligence. I just impulsively rushed out and bought a telescope, which was certainly the wrong thing to do, and hopefully you're going to see the folly of doing things that way in this video. I rushed out and I bought a telescope, and it turned out to be a very poor decision. And so that's sort of gives you the background of how this all came about. Now, let me put this whole thing in perspective by just mentioning a few things here before we get started with the specifics of this video. Some of you already have the telescope that I'm going to be talking about here. More than likely, some of you do. Some of you may consider buying it in the future. This is a very popular telescope. It's a bestseller on some of the large internet sales channels out there. It's one that you're going to find. It's going to pop up when you start searching for telescopes and doing research on buying telescopes. And some of you no doubt probably already have this telescope. And even though what I'm going to say about it today is going to be very negative on balance, please don't take that as me casting any aspersions on your intelligence because you were stupid enough to buy this telescope. That would be a strange thing for me to do, since I bought this telescope myself and I should have known better, and yet I bought it anyway. So if you've already got this, please don't take this personally. I'm just using this as an example of how you have to be patient and how you have to take the time to do the right things the right way in all aspects of amateur astronomy, and especially with regard to making decisions about buying astronomy gear. Okay? So please don't be upset with me if you've already got this telescope. I have one too. Secondly, this telescope, this is the telescope I'm talking about right here. It's a Celestron product. This is the Celestron Power Seeker 127 EQ telescope. Now, please don't take this video as an attack on Celestron. Celestron is a very good company. I like Celestron. I've bought a lot of Celestron products. My favorite telescope that I've ever had, the one that I have now, the one that I use the most, is a Celestron Nextar 8SE Schmidt-Cassegrainian telescope. I love it. It's a great all-purpose telescope. I've got a lot of other pieces of Celestron gear, everything from external 12-volt power supplies to autofocusers to a nice 8 to 24 millimeter zoom eyepiece and so forth. So I am not trying to portray Celestron in a negative light. Not at all. One of my favorite companies. I love them. I love their products. Except in this instance. You know, sometimes I guess even good companies can produce something that's, let's say, not a high quality product. And in my judgment, this is such a case here. But this is not an attack on Celestron, which is a great company. So please keep that in mind. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that what I'm going to say to you in this video is based on my personal experience. Now, that's all that I can speak to. Some of you who may own this telescope may have had you know, a good experience with it. Maybe you've been able to use it to good advantage. Maybe you've had fun with it. Maybe you've learned from it. Maybe it's really good for you as you pursue the hobby. That has not been the case for me. If you've had a good experience with this telescope, tell me about it in the comments section of the video. I'd love to hear about that. And hopefully, if those of you that own this telescope have had a good experience with it. I hope so. I have not. And I regret buying this telescope. And I bought this telescope because I wasn't patient and because I failed to do the right things the right way, and I failed to do proper due diligence. So why did I buy this telescope? Well, I've already disclosed that it was an impulsive purchase because I was eager to get a telescope and get out there. And as I went out there and started looking at the kind of telescopes that were available in the modest priced range that I was able to spend at the time, this telescope just kept popping up over and over again. It was easily available to view and look at on all of the big retail internet sales channels and internet sales channels. It's a top seller on Amazon. It's a lot of telescope for the money, and that's what struck me right up front. You know, this is a 5-inch reflecting telescope, 5-inch aperture. It has a nice optical tube. It comes with a finder scope. It comes with 2 eyepieces and a Barlow lens. Comes with an equatorial mount, including the balance weights down here. Slow motion control cables, and it comes with a nice metal tripod down here. So it's a lot of telescope. And then I looked at the price of this telescope, which at the time, I don't know what it is now, I haven't looked today, but at the time it was $180 US. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of telescope for $180. You know, nice aperture, 5 inches. You theoretically can see a lot with a 5-inch telescope. You know, all the things that come with it, an equatorial mount. And so I was intrigued right off the bat. A lot of telescope for a modest price. I looked a little bit further. I looked at the reviews on the major internet sales channels, and I found that there are thousands of reviews of this product. And on average, those reviews rated this a 4 out of 5 star telescope. And so I said, you know, this is great. And I kind of stopped at that point, and I said, I'm going to buy this telescope. A lot of telescope for that kind of money, rated 4 out of 5 stars by thousands of reviewers. You know, why not? I stopped right there, which is something that you never ever do as an amateur astronomer. You don't just go so far and then stop and say and make your decision at that point and then try to move forward and expect to have decent results. That's not the way it works. You have to be patient. You have to do the right things the right way. You have to do your due diligence, especially when it comes to purchasing astronomy gear. I didn't do my due diligence, and I bought this telescope. Now, I should have got the message right off the bat that I was making a bad decision, because I saw that Amazon had one of these in box, you know, not new, but in the box for $140. So I said, hey, I can save $40 by getting this in the box item, you know. And so I ordered the in the box item. And that's something that I will never do again. Maybe you've had good experience buying in the box items on these internet channels. It was a horrible experience. When this thing came in, the box was damaged. I opened up the box and it was obvious that this had been a return, and whoever had returned this telescope had given no thought whatsoever to repacking it. They just threw everything in the box helter-skelter, and not only that, but a lot of the pieces were missing. I opened the box and I was appalled. The optical tube was dented and scratched. One of these tubes, which attaches the optical tube to the mount, was badly deformed. One of the two eyepieces was missing. The front cap for the telescope was missing and nowhere to be found. And one of the tripod legs was damaged and slipped and would not stay extended. I mean, there were more things wrong than there were things right. There were more things missing, it seemed like, than things that were actually present when I opened that box and looked in there. I boxed it up and sent it back, and fortunately Amazon is good about accepting returns, and I had no issues with any of that. So maybe I should have considered that to be a sort of a portent, if you will. Maybe I should have realized maybe I'm not supposed to be buying this telescope. But I sent that one back and I ordered a new one for the $180, and when it came, no problems. Box was not damaged. I opened it up. Everything was present. It was well packed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. I was in business. So I took that telescope out of the box and I assembled it per the instructions, and I sat back and admired it, and you know, it's a pretty good looking piece of equipment here, and you know, it's nice looking. And I thought, there we are. I'm all assembled and ready to go. I'm ready to plunge back into this hobby again. I can't wait. And that's when despair began to settle in, because I realized that I had bought a telescope that was basically an instrument of low quality that just didn't work for me. Now again, no attack on Celestron here. They could have made this a much better telescope had they chosen to do so, but of course it would have been much more expensive had they done that. So the thing to keep in mind here is you get what you pay for. This was a lot of telescope for the money. Turns out that a lot of the aspects of this telescope are low quality, and this is a perfect example of that old adage, you get what you pay for. It just never worked for me. There was just too many deficiencies, and I'd like to share with you what some of those are. Not to tear this product down, but again to try to get across the point that you've got to be patient, you've got to do the right things the right way, you've got to do your due diligence, and you need to know what you're doing before you go out there and do anything in amateur astronomy, especially with regard to purchasing astronomy gear. Okay, so let me just do a brief review of this telescope. The optical tube is fine. You know, seems to be made of, reasonably high quality material. Couldn't find any issues whatsoever with the optical tube. Once you get past that, however, you start to find difficulties right away. Let's start with the viewfinder. The viewfinder that came with this telescope was, in a word, awful. Extremely low quality, plastic materials, and I never could get it to fit right on the tube. No matter how much I tightened that thing down on there, as tight as I could possibly get it, it still would somehow find a way to slip around a little bit. And of course, when that happens, you lose the alignment between the finder scope and the optical tube, and you have to start all over again. You know, a viewfinder is no good to you if it's not aligned with the telescope. I never could get it to work right. It was you could tell by just holding it and looking at it, extremely poor build quality. You know what I did with it? I didn't try to store it away. I didn't try to give it away. I didn't try to sell it. I threw it in a trash can. I absolutely threw it away and replaced it with this red dot finder, which is on here now, which is a really good upgrade from the piece of junk that was on this telescope before. The eyepieces, extremely low quality. I no longer have those eyepieces. or I would show them to you so that you could see what I'm talking about. You'll have to take my word for it. There was a 20 millimeter eyepiece that for some reason came with an erecting prism in it, which added to the complexity of the eyepiece and put something else in the optical path to cheat you of light coming through the light path of the telescope. I guess they assumed that a lot of people would buy this telescope to use for terrestrial viewing. They put an erecting prism in that 20 millimeter eyepiece, but the whole thing was a very low quality. The little 4 millimeter eyepiece that came with the telescope, 4 millimeters, yes, very high powered eyepiece, was also of extremely low quality, extremely poor quality, just not something that you want to try to use to view objects through a telescope. The Barlow lens that came with it was a 3x Barlow lens, as opposed to the 2x that normally comes with a telescope when you buy a kit. And it was of extremely low quality as well. Now, I never understood, they gave you a 4 millimeter eyepiece with this telescope and a 3x Barlow lens. Now this telescope has a focal length of 1,000 millimeters, and if you go through the math here, if you were to use that Barlow lens in combination with that 4 millimeter eyepiece, you would be looking at a magnification of 750x. I don't know, I'm not sure I've ever known anybody using amateur telescopes who's even been willing to even suggest or try a magnification of 750x, but that certainly is far beyond the maximum effective magnification of this telescope. And why they would give you eyepieces and a Barlow that would yield a 750x magnification, frankly, is beyond me. I don't know if they were just trying to make people think that, hey, you can really magnify things and really get close up with this telescope and the eyepieces and the things that are included with it. That, to me, just bordered a little bit on the ridiculous side. So anyway, eyepieces were of very low quality. The mount. Now this is a German equatorial mount. I've had some experience with equatorial mounts over the years, and I was eager to get another one and try it out. This came with these balancing weights, these counterweights down here. Came with the slow motion control cables and the declination and right ascension circles and so forth. An equatorial mount, and I was excited to have an equatorial mount to use and to play with. Just not this equatorial mount. This mount is absolutely inadequate to support this optical tube and whatever other things you might want to attach to this optical tube. For example, a camera, let's say. It just simply is inadequate to support this telescope. It has clutches here, of course, that you can tighten down to lock this telescope in place. Once you've got the object you want to look at in your field of view, you can lock these axes down with these knobs here, and supposedly all you have to do then is use these slow motion control cables to follow that object across the sky. Well, no matter how much I tightened these clutch knobs down, and I tightened them down as much as this 72-year-old hand was able to tighten, and I'm still pretty able to do that. No matter how much I tightened these down, they would eventually slip and come loose, and usually at the wrong possible time. When you're trying to view an object that you've managed to get in the field of view of your telescope, and now you've got it locked in so that you can easily track it across the sky with just the right ascension control, slow motion control cable, this thing would suddenly come loose and slip, and that axis, whichever one it was, would slip, and the telescope would move, and whatever you're trying to look at is suddenly gone from the field of view. And you're out there in the dark trying to get this thing back in the field of view again, trying to lock these axes down again. Just wouldn't work. I could not lock these things down enough to hold them in place, and that was a very frustrating thing to experience. That's not the only knobs on this telescope that wouldn't lock in place. These slow motion control cables are held in place with a little set screw here. You slip these cables onto the axis and lock them down, and that enables you then to make small adjustments to the telescope so that you can track an object across the sky. Theoretically, a very good concept, works very, very well. But once again, no matter how much I tighten these screws down, tighten them as hard as I possibly could, these screws fit in little grooves in the axis to tighten it down, they would work loose. They would start to work loose almost as soon as you started to operate the cables. And you would come to a point where all of a sudden this thing would come loose and maybe just slip right into your hand, come completely loose, and there you're holding it in your hand and it's not connected to anything. Or it would get to the place where it would just kind of slip around and not do anything or not move at all. Just a very, very frustrating thing to do, and that happened very, very frequently, almost to the point to where you couldn't count on these slow motion control cables doing what you needed them to do for any significant amount of time when you're out there trying to view objects in the night sky. So I couldn't keep the axes locked in place with this telescope. I couldn't keep the slow motion control cables locked in place. That's not all, however. Let me demonstrate why this mount is just as inadequate for this telescope. I'm going to lock everything down here. Lock it all down real tight. And even though it's now locked down as tight as I can get it, you can see how much wobble is involved with this telescope. And most of that give or that wobble or that play is coming from right in here, where these right ascension and declination rings attached to the rest of the mount. Very, very unstable, very, very wobbly assembly, which gave rise to a lot of vibration, a lot of movement, and that kind of thing. So maybe this mount would work with a smaller, more lightweight telescope. It didn't work for me with this telescope. It was just totally inadequate, and I was disappointed with it from the get-go, and remain disappointed in it to this day. So that has been my experience with this telescope. Now, is it a completely worthless telescope? No, of course not. I'm not sure there's any such thing. I've done a lot of viewing with this telescope, despite its deficiencies. I've done a lot of viewing of the moon. I've taken some decent photographs of the moon through this telescope. I've looked at the planets a little bit. I've had little or no success in trying to view deep sky objects, but that has as much to do with light pollution and the faintness of these objects as it does the quality of the telescope. So I can't really put all the blame for that on the telescope, but I have done some viewing with it, and some decent viewing of the moon in particular. And many of you, as I've said before, may have been able to do some good viewing with this, and maybe your experience has been better than mine. But my experience with this telescope has not been good for the reasons I've just given. There's one other thing I want to mention here that I would have known about had I bothered to do enough due diligence when I was evaluating this telescope. This telescope has a focal length of 1,000 millimeters, and if you know anything about telescopes, maybe you've watched my previous videos, you might wonder, how can you get 1,000 millimeter focal length in a tube this short? Well, you can't. If this was a traditional Newtonian reflector, which I thought it was when I bought it, turns out it's not. It's something called a Burge-Jones variant of a reflecting telescope, which means that it has not only a primary and secondary mirror in it, but it also has a lens in the light path, which is something that you do not find in a traditional Newtonian reflecting telescope. And what's the purpose of that lens in there? Twofold in this case. Number one, it's sort of like a Barlow lens, if you will. It's sort of a relay lens that enables you to get more focal length in a shorter tube. So it enables you to extend the focal length of the telescope. And the other purpose of that lens in there is to try to correct some of the spherical aberration that you get with this telescope. Because you see, this telescope has a spherical primary mirror in the back here, rather than the parabolic mirror that you might see on better reflecting telescopes. Spherical mirrors introduce something called spherical aberration into your view. Don't want to get into the technicalities of what that is, but with spherical mirrors, you just cannot get a good, sharp, decent focus of the image that you're looking at. So in order to correct that, they put this little lens in there which tries to refract the light in such a way as to correct for some of that spherical aberration. And so that's the second reason they put it in there, so that they could use a cheap spherical lens, mirror in the construction of this telescope. Now, I'm not sure that that is inherently a bad design or a bad thing to put that lens in there, although I tend to say that anytime you put anything within the light path within a telescope that's going to cut down on the light throughput coming through the telescope, that's a questionable thing to do. But again, maybe that Burge-Jones concept really would work in better circumstances, but there's a complication here. It has to do with where they put that lens in this telescope. It happens to be between the secondary mirror and the eyepiece, and that prevents you from being able to collimate the telescope. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of that. Reflecting telescopes can sometimes have a condition in which the two mirrors in there get out of alignment with one another a little bit. You have to bring those back into alignment through a process known as collimation, where you just simply adjust the angle between the mirrors using adjustment screws and bring it back into collimation so that you can get a nice sharp image again. In order to do that with this telescope, you pretty much have to remove this lens that's in here, this relay lens, if you will, because it's in the way of doing collimation of the telescope. Now, I've heard people say that you can collimate it with that in there. I had difficulty, and if you have to take that out of there in order to collimate the telescope, you have to take this off. You have to take that lens out of there. You have to put this back on, do your collimation, take this back off, put the lens back in there, put this back on. So it makes collimating the telescope a very difficult and tedious proposition, much more so than normal. So had I done my due diligence and read more about this and understood that this was a Burge-Jones telescope with that relay lens, so to speak, in there, I wouldn't have bought the telescope. I was looking for a Newtonian reflector, and that's not what I got. And the reason that happened was because I failed to take the time to do the proper due diligence. Let me tell you what I should have done. I shouldn't have just been captivated or pulled in by this very modest cost for a telescope that seemed to have a lot of nice features. I shouldn't have contented myself with just the 4 out of 5 star average reviews from the major internet sales channels. I should have gone to somewhere like cloudynights.com or other places where knowledgeable, experienced amateur astronomers do reviews and post and provide advice. I would have learned, had I done that this is a Burge-Jones telescope. I would have learned from other reviewers about all of the issues, the quality issues surrounding this telescope, and I wouldn't have bought it. I wouldn't, my wallet would not be $180 lighter. I would have used that money to buy a higher quality telescope within that general price range. But I gave in to impulse. I got taken in by a telescope that seemed to be a lot of scope for the money, and I bought it without being patient, without taking the time to do the right things the right way, without doing enough research, without doing proper due diligence. And the message to you is, don't do what I did. When you're buying a telescope or any other piece of astronomy gear, when you're doing anything that relates to the hobby of amateur astronomy, be patient. Take the time to do the right things the right way. Do due diligence. make sure of what you're doing before you do it. Don't do what I did. In this instance, I was a person who, that kind of person that's a do like I say, not like I do person. I didn't follow my own advice that I preached throughout these videos. I jumped into something impulsively, and I regret doing it. As I said, I did some viewing of this early on, and it wasn't a worthless telescope. I did get some enjoyment and some nice views, particularly of the moon with the telescope, but I haven't used it in a long time, and I doubt very seriously if I'll ever take it out and try to do any viewing again. So what will I do with it? I thought about selling it, but I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure I could have lived with myself if I sold this telescope to some unsuspecting person who might not have known what they were getting and who would have been disappointed with it and put off by it. I thought about giving it to maybe one of my grandchildren or someone else, but then I decided I didn't want to do that, and for the same reasons. I didn't want to turn them off to the hobby. And so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to keep this telescope. It's going to be somewhere nearby, and it's going to be a constant reminder to me to not be impulsive. It's going to be a reminder to me to be patient, to take the time to do the right things the right way, and to do due diligence, the proper amount of research and due diligence before I ever buy another piece of astronomy gear. And I hope that will be the message to you. Be patient. Take the time to do the right things the right way. Do research and due diligence, and don't just rely on what people tell you on reviews, on major internet sales channels and that kind of thing. Get information from people who really know about these things, who can give you the right and the proper advice. So I guess my final word on this would be that my purchase of this telescope is a perfect example of the truth of two old adages that we need to always keep in mind and never forget when we're purchasing astronomy gear or anything else, probably for that matter. And those two pieces of advice, of course, are these. Number one, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And in this case, it definitely was. Sounded like a lot of telescope for the money, and indeed it was, but it's a low quality telescope for the money. And so it sounded too good to be true, and I fell into that. The second adage that this illustrates is that you get what you pay for. Now, I can't put all the fault on Celestron or the people that sell this telescope. It's an instance of you get what you pay for. You're getting a lot of telescope for a very modest cost. It's just not a very good telescope. But if you can live with that, if you can take a telescope that's not very good and use it and have fun with it and learn from it and pay only $180 to do so, then fine. And so maybe that's another perspective, another way to look at this. But just remember, you get what you pay for, and that's certainly true when you're buying astronomy gear. So, don't do what I did. Be patient. Take the time to do the right things the right way. Do your due diligence. Make sure that you're being wise in spending your limited dollars on astronomy gear, because you can spend a lot of dollars on astronomy gear, and it's very, very important that you spend that money the right way on the right things. So that's my story. That's using myself as a negative example that hopefully illustrates how not to approach this hobby in general, and especially how not to approach purchasing astronomy gear. I did a very poor job. I hope you will benefit from this and not make the same mistakes that I did. And again, if you've got this telescope, don't take this personally. I'm just relating to you my own personal experience. Here's the thing that bothers me the most about this telescope, and I'll conclude with this. In the sales advertising for this telescope, they claim that this is a beginner's telescope. This is not a beginner's telescope. Even if it was a decent telescope, it probably still wouldn't be a good choice for a beginner because of the equatorial mount and various other aspects of the telescope. I've said before, and I stick by this, if you're a beginner buying your first telescope, go simple. A manual mount, a good manual mount, something like a Dobsonian mount, and a good reflecting telescope that's got as much aperture as you can afford, that's the route you need to go. This is not a beginner's telescope, especially given its low quality. If I were a rank beginner, if I'd never used a telescope before, if I hadn't participated in the hobby before, and I bought this telescope, I probably would have walked away from the hobby within just a few days because I would have been so frustrated and so disappointed with this telescope and frustrated with trying to use this telescope that I would have probably said, this is not for me. This telescope, if considered in the sense in which it's being advertised as a beginner's telescope, is a potential hobby-killing telescope. I mean, it really is. And that's the biggest problem I have with Celestron making and marketing this telescope. They can make and sell this telescope, of course, and they're selling a lot of them. And maybe people are having a good experience with them out there. But to claim that it's for a beginner is really a disservice to the hobby, because this is going to be a very frustrating telescope for people who've never used one before. A potential hobby killer, and we never like to see anything like that. So that's the thing that bothers me most about it. Again, not attacking Celestron. Other companies, many other companies produce hobby-killing telescopes that are much worse than this one. Celestron's a good company. No question about that. But this is not a beginner's telescope, and it's not a good telescope in general. At least that has been my experience. And I could have avoided making this mistake. I'm over making the point here, I know. But I made a mistake in buying this telescope because I wasn't patient. I didn't take the time to do the right things the right way. I didn't do enough of the right kinds of research. I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't even know what kind of telescope I was actually buying. And that's a very bad thing to admit. That's my story. And I hope you've learned something from this and that you will realize the importance of approaching the hobby the right way. I hope you won't make the same mistakes that I've made. And I just hope that this has been something that is that will make a lasting impression upon you as to how you have to approach this hobby in order to enjoy it and be successful at it. Patience, diligence, doing the right things the right way. That's the recipe for success as an amateur astronomer. So, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back soon with another video. And until then, let me just close as always by wishing all of you clear skies and good viewing.